Remember everyone, total eclipse first. Otherwise, the real reason you slice around in a panic is because your character's panicking over you doing it wrong. Welcome back to the Mentor Roulette grind. This time around, we have 11 duties as Reaper, with today's theme being, oh right, content before Shadowbringers technically do exist. We did have some variety this time around at least, and no MSQ roulettes. With that said, we still had a lot of dungeons with a weirdly strong emphasis on 50, 60, 70, 80, and expert roulette duties. Now, with all that said, for duty 1, we landed in the Lunar Subterrane. However, shocking probably no one, we just went through the motions of rushing through the duty. A very easy start. For duty 2, we went to St. Mociannes Arboretum. Hard. On the second boss, we have this similar mechanic to the boss in Lunar Subterrane, with the key difference being that in this dungeon, it is not stoppable by arm's length. Isn't that strange? However, despite me planning to move into position in the last moment, the healer decides to rescue me, which instead seals my fate to get hit with nothing I can do about it. Another interesting thing about this dungeon is that most of the mobs have a damage reduction buff from the mud covering them, and we are presented no way to deal with it. But here, at the end, these valves clean the mobs, for example revealing that these giant mud blobs were actually these giant water sprites all along. You just have to press the button and have the mobs run into the water. And finally on the last boss, while we had some mess-ups, one thing that was handled carefully was the small mud slime. If it gets hit by any mud-related mechanics, it grows, and if it grows just once or twice, it will do massive damage to everyone, so we don't want that. I think this is the first time in a long while that the mud slime has not got hit by anything a single time. Overall, a great run with not that much to talk about in terms of mistakes. For duty 3, we went to Dohn Mheg. Right at the start, the tank seemed mildly confused, but I will say that all interrupts that needed to happen did happen. The rest of the dungeon went great, even the extra big pull shortly before the last boss went well. With that said, the first boss has a mechanic I know a lot of players have a lot of trouble with: Lance Blot. So here's a tip to make sure you don't get hit. The way the mechanic works is each stomp produces some new AoE zones that will detonate. It also advances the existing zones. And the zones that have been advanced once already explode. But the trick here is that the zones that explode will be guaranteed safe for the next stomp. So the way I usually deal with this mechanic is to position myself near one of the first stomp zones. And once a zone explodes, I'll simply step onto a recently exploded zone, repeatedly, until the mechanic ends. This way, I can guide myself around to safe spots without thinking too much about it. Granted, you can deal with this mechanic in other ways, and definitely in a way that requires less movement, but if you start getting hit, it has this tendency to trip you up so you will get hit again, and it is just a bad time. Try this next time you get Dohn Mheg. For duty 4, we went to Castrum Marinum, or Emerald Weapon, with, in my opinion, one of the best boss themes in the game. Everyone played really well, so not much to say on that. In fact, the dancer who partnered me was really consistent about their devilment, which ultimately led me to feeling awkward because at level 80, Reaper doesn't have Enshroud in the opener, and, well, if you use an Enshroud at the wrong time, you definitely don't have one for the 2-minute burst. And somehow, I quite consistently got that wrong. Something I really like about this fight is that, despite being a normal difficulty fight, it really sells the overwhelming force of the Black Wolf. Because the fight comes out swinging with the most brutal mechanics in the entire fight immediately after the checkpoint. The super strong push effects that can just outright kill multiple players, the insane amount of overlapping cross AoEs, all of that. Both of these mechanics have the capacity to wipe you out immediately, but by placing them in this way right at the start, you don't lose that much if you do wipe. Which makes it an excellent way to pace a normal difficulty fight by front-loading the hardest part right at the very start. It challenges the group enough to sell that the boss is powerful, while still ultimately almost letting you win after a bit. Still a pretty good design for a normal difficulty fight. For Duty 5, we have Eden's Titan, or E4N. The duty went safely enough, but we did have some deaths. Anyone who knows this fight probably already knows exactly how that happened. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and done! For anyone that are having a bit of a hard time with this fight, when Titan gets into position and changes modes, there are two particular things to worry about. If he enhances his arms, then you have to stand in front of him first and then move to the side afterwards. If he produces his go card, then you have to stand next to him, on the side facing inwards on the arena, so you have as much space behind you as possible. Typically, he will only get to do the go kart mechanic twice, and if he does, the second time he will use it 3 times in succession, so you have to repeatedly get into position. And then he finishes with a donut AoE, which naturally you have to get in under. If he does do the arm enhancements a second time, that one gets a bit more complex, but he will swipe at one side of the arena and then explode on the other. So similar to the first time, you get to one side then the other. The mechanics aren't that hard, but because the punishment is usually instant death, they are too mean to get wrong. For Duty 6, we went to the Aetherfont. Expert roulette stuff, so naturally everything went perfectly fine. This of course also invites me to be extremely pedantic and say that, personally, I prefer to use the AoE limit break on the final pull before the boss. Because usually the 2-minute burst cooldowns are available for the first pull, so by saving the limit break for the next pull, we get 2 shorter pulls instead of 1 super short and 1 longer. On the other hand, this run was going quite fast, and sometimes it would be possible when going fast enough that the 2-minute burst simply isn't ready yet on the first pull, which would make this strategy better. In this run, this was not the case though, at least not from me. On the other hand, using the limit break on the first pull rather than the second gives more time for the limit break to recharge again before the boss. But then again, in a group like this, we would get limit break 1 on the boss in time anyway, but regardless of what we do, limit break 2 will be ready far too late, so who really knows what would be most helpful here, right? For Duty 7, we went to the Twinning, which you'd think should almost be cause for celebration, right? I initially thought the same, but well, the tank didn't seem to know how to play their job. Sure, this is their first time in this duty, but at level 80, they were spamming Prominence multiple times when rounding up mobs, without using Total Eclipse first. I don't know why, because at other times they would use Total Eclipse first. They were not that good about using defensive cooldowns either, which put a lot more strain on the healer, although they seem to do fine on that front. The tank also used Provoke as part of their rotation, which is never a good sign, because it indicates that they have no idea what they're doing, more than anything else. The healer obviously managed to heal through all this, which is of course impressive, however, the healer also pulled way in advance for the first timer tank, which I don't think is the right call either. Sure, the tank didn't seem to be interested in pulling multiple packs most of the time, but forcing it like this makes everything more chaotic, and I don't imagine the tank had very much room to try and stabilize that much either. I suppose the healer being able to carry on that front made it not matter that much. And finally, probably partly thanks to the healer's pulling, the red mage regularly had mobs on them, which itself isn't a big deal, but then I'm not sure whether they just didn't care or they outright believed they did more damage by being further away or something. Probably not that one. Because they would regularly move away from the mobs targeting them, but never directly towards the tank, electing to instead circle around the blob of enemies. This actually was resolved by the tank typically using Provoke. On the one hand, the mob is right there, the tank should easily be able to pick it up. On the other hand, surely the red mage also see that the tank was a sprout and had enough on their plate already. And on top of that, like I've talked about before, congratulations! The mob is on you. It is now your responsibility to at least bring it to the tank. Some of you might also say that at least some of these things could have been resolved by giving tips to the tank, and you're certainly right. But on the first boss, I tried to both advise the tank to not aim the mechanics at the cages, which didn't help, And I also tried to tell them that fire burns because they stood in it and it did nothing. So I don't think giving any other advice would have helped either. Now, despite all of this, we didn't really have any deaths or wipes, so I guess the run went fine. For duty 8, we had the Guildhest under the armor, so speedrun time. Let's go fast, and 21 seconds in total. What a ridiculous duty. For duty 9, we went to Arm of the Sun in Alexander, the one with Quick Think's All Thoughts himself. The group played really well, so things went well. In fact, we even managed to prevent the hearts from reaching Quick Thinks, blocking him from the boosted Grand Sim. It is, however, one of those kinds of boss fights where you hardly ever wipe, so a lot of mechanics are dealt with through the amazing strategy of ignore it, just attack, and it tends to work anyway. For duty 10, we went to E11N, or Fatebreaker, or Vanjeet, or Rankret, or however you want to name him. This fight also went very well, and most, if not all of our deaths came as a result of knockbacks, which is weirdly familiar with E4N, right? With that said, this boss does have a few mechanics that are particularly brutal, so let's talk about them a bit. Burnt Strike is a mechanic that happens many times throughout the fight, and depending on what magic swirls around Fatebreaker as it is being cast, the follow-up effect changes. If lightning swirls around him, a second, wider blast happens immediately after, so standing further away than normal is recommended. If fire swirls around him instead, then a knockback effect will happen, which means you should actually be as close as you can. As these two are polar opposites, it is very important to keep track of what element is happening. Later in the fight, he will also sometimes use it with light swirling him, and that causes circle AoEs to appear on each player location, making stacking up closely the safest approach, as that gives more space to run away to, by baiting them. The second mechanic that may be worth keeping in mind is Bound by Faith, specifically with lightning swirling Fatebreaker, as this places a brutal dot on whoever he chooses to target, often a healer. Some players suggest that you can avoid the dot entirely by running far enough away, but I've yet to see this work, and I've seen people run almost the entire arena's length, so I doubt it would ever work. Regardless, be aware of this and make sure to heal whoever gets the dot. The third mechanic to be aware of is Turn of the Heavens. It puts a bunch of circles on the field, some fire, some lightning, and whichever element he's channeling while casting the spell will explode wider. Meaning, if he channels fire, the fire circles will explode wider than normal. And if he channels lightning, the lightning circles explode wider. The element he's not channeling simply explodes in their circle areas, so you can hide next to them just fine. Finally, once in the fight, he will cast Prismatic Deception, which places 3 invisible Fatebreakers that will cast a line AoE. They are only visible if you get close enough to them, and they are on the edge of the arena, and right next to each other. So once you find one, you have a strong idea of where the other 2 are. To deal with this mechanic, find one Fatebreaker and hide in the safe spot next to them. Most of the other mechanics I believe you should be able to handle easily on the go. For duty 11, we went to Matoya's Relict, and this time the healer didn't quite seem to get the mudball mechanic. But they managed to heal themselves through it. It was only a problem the second time, but it is worth pointing out that if you can heal through it, it is at least better to do that than send the ball to the wrong destination. The mud monsters certainly will not reward you in a beneficial way if you give it to them. On the second boss, we also had a classic case of forget the previous mechanic has not yet ended because the next mechanic started. But it did not lead to any deaths, fortunately. I also have a bit of a nitpick here on the trash leading up to the final boss. These line AoEs don't really hurt that much, and even if they did, you can actually sprint past them in time, usually. The tank being a little too respectful to them caused a bit of a weird stop. A minor detail. Anyway, on top of this, the ranged DPS could have used Limit Break on these mobs. I know that's also insanely nitpicky, but I will explain myself in just a moment. For the tank, they also acted like this big mob couldn't get turned at all. Fortunately, I had True North. For the record, not only can this mob get turned, you can move it. And after this mob, the bard immediately uses Return, which is a skip that can save you a few seconds. As you can see here, the time save is like 2 seconds, given how close I am to the bard when I took the proper path. The reason why I was being nitpicky about the limit break is that the bot was so caught up in this return 2-second time save, but didn't do the much greater time save of using limit break for more damage, which is more widely applicable. I'm just saying. Finally, on the final boss, I'm quite curious what the bot was doing over in Narnia when we were fighting the tornado. They did make it in time for the knockback, but just barely. I just don't see any benefit to being in Narnia for this, since then you have to cross the entire arena to reach safety. Yes, I am aware all of the things in this duty were a lot of nitpicking, but that should tell you that the duty went perfectly fine, and I had not much else to talk about beyond, we could do better. Another good set. Fortunately, me having basically no support options didn't turn around to become a problem. I wonder if I can make it to 200 Mentor Roulettes before Dawn Trail. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, blue mages have had access to the spell Magic Hammer for years at this point, but so did the first boss in Dawn Mheg. However, when blue mages were made able to reach level 80, the boss in Dawn Mheg got his Magic Hammer replaced with Candy Cane, which interestingly happens to be the opposite of Magic Hammer, and even shares cooldown with it.